But I think welcome to Dr. Carl Grod, a podcast that's dedicated to exploring what makes the secular sacred. I'm Jameson, one of your co-hosts. Consider me your resident enthusiast. I'm joined today by
Ben Burnside, also an enthusiast.
no, he's our resident professor, elbow patches himself.
Ugh.
He refuses to accept that mantle, but after 30 episodes through Stockholm Syndrome, I'll wear him down and he'll actually show up in a jacket with elbow patches. Our podcast is based around exploring what about narratives, especially in slightly more nerdy hobbies, draw us together. What is it about shared story? What is it about our interest? What is it that resonates with us regardless of our background or perspective? As a reminder, we are ministers. We serve in the greater Houston area at the moment, and we bring a Christian lens to our hobbies and experiences. But as we've said, we find things that are nerdy a fertile ground for conversation with people of a wide variety of beliefs. You don't get quizzed on your particular faith expression before you're allowed to be a Star Wars fan, for instance. And speaking of Star Wars,
Star Wars.
that is the topic of today's podcast. Now, you may have seen the title, Last Jedi, and you may be thinking to yourself, that is not a controversial film at all. I cannot search YouTube and find any videos that would suggest that anyone has been displeased or that people don't chastise others for not recognizing its hidden genius. Would you say it's a fairly neutral film?
Very neutral. Like a rom-com.
Right. That is perhaps one way to describe it.
Completely unoffensive.
Completely unoffensive. It welcomes people of all ages. But the aspect we wanted to bring was not so much a deep dive critique of plot and structure and what the director is trying to do, but rather, why is it that we were so offended or elated as a fan base? I think anyone that walked into The Last Jedi, it's fair to say, had an emotional experience.
Yeah.
And it was either positive or negative. And we'll get to what range of emotion we felt after we saw it in just a second. But like all of our podcasts, before we jump into The Last Jedi, let's do something completely different. A part of our show where we have prepared a random question for our co-host, just as an opportunity to put them on live air and see if they can respond accordingly.
Oh.
So Burnside, I'm going to practice my manners.
Okay.
Who would you like to go first? Me or you?
Well, I think you should go first.
I guess I should have specified.
I'd like you to pose the question first.
Awesome. So one thing I have always wondered, and I hope you can answer today. Are English crumpets really as good as they say in England?
I've never had an English crumpet. That's a very odd question.
In all of your studies in England, you never had a crumpet?
Well, what even is a crumpet?
It's like a biscuit.
No, a biscuit is a cookie. Everybody knows that.
Well, aren't crumpets like muffiny things? They're
not biscuits.
They're like biscuits here.
Biscuits are just chocolate chip cookies.
No, I get that, but I'm saying, isn't a crumpet like a biscuit in England? Are we losing people? All right.
That was a terrible question.
Okay, well, I'm a little rusty, all right? I thought you would have some... I want to know what to put with my marmalade later, and apparently I'm going to be having none of that. So let's just move on. What do you want to ask me?
If you want to have a English tea time, I'm probably not your person.
It's good to know. I'm filing that away.
So I had a more... I don't know. My question, going with the theme of today, is I know that science fiction is not your favorite genre, but what would be your favorite science fiction film?
That is a good question because science fiction is not my favorite genre. Wow. I'll go cheesy a little bit, and I'll go with Kubrick, and I'll say 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's hard not to love that film, and I will say when I watched it first on, I think it was VHS as a kid, I did not have a positive experience of it because I watched it in my friend's home, and we're kind of like, what's the big deal about this film?
You have to pay attention.
Right. However, when I was older, and Burnside and I were supposed to see it together, and one of us got radically ill, so I was left with still a ticket and seeing it by myself at the Alamo Draft House here in Houston. I was blown away by how incredible it was on the big screen. It's one of those films that almost can't be seen at home, or at least a home that I own. I do not own a home that has a theater style setup. Let me be clear, but yeah, that's easily probably my favorite sci-fi. It's not the most approachable one. So I'm trying to think to be more polite. If I was going to recommend a movie to someone out there who's maybe into sci-fi and hasn't seen it, honestly, a pretty good one that's come out recently that I think a lot of people would get behind is The Edge of Tomorrow with Emily Blunt and Tom Cruise. Kind of that time travel action film. It's pretty good, I think.
I didn't ask you for your general recommendation.
All right. I apologize. I'm just trying to be friendly and I'm being met with hostility. So I'll keep that opinion to myself, but you should totally check it out. No. So I'll work on my question for next time. I'm sorry. If you came here and you thought this was the Great British Baking Show, I apologize. We're going to lose you. I was trying to keep you tagged in, expand the fan base, Burnside, and you will have none of that. So we're going to be moving on to the main part of our podcast, which is talking about The Last Jedi and specifically what it means to have unwelcome narratives. And we'll talk a little bit about the buildup of Star Wars fandom in general, why there's so much energy around a franchise that honestly has produced very little in what I consider to kind of be official canon, at least on the silver screen, But it's incredible that with that limited scope, they have generated such a huge fan base. So, why don't we talk a little bit about the humble origins of Star Wars? Back in the day, there was a boy named George, and he had a dream of wars in space in a galaxy long, long ago. This is where we should have a text scroll, right? So,
yeah, George Lucas. There's an amazing documentary about this on Disney Plus. If you would like to watch, I forget the name, but he was an experimental filmmaker that had made some commercial films and put together this crazy idea he had for Star Wars. And at the time, Star Wars was, science fiction movies were cheaply done, massively produced, and no one really cared. And he had an idea to do it right. He was influenced by all kinds of cinema and put together a movie that frankly blew people away. It came out, it was expected to be a giant failure.
Mm-hmm.
And
it took 4 years of production just because they kept struggling with financing and like getting things off the ground. It's amazing to think that kind of like if you were in the 70s and you knew a guy named Bill or a guy named George, those would have been the people that I would have wanted to invest a couple dollars in. That's all I'm saying.
So yeah, that began the phenomenon, and it took a huge impact in culture because people who went to the cinema had never seen anything like it, and all of a sudden there was a craze, a marketing craze, which is another genius of George Lucas to market this science fiction movie that had not been done before. So now there are toys and T-shirts and cereal bowls.
And we always like to drop in some unasked for trivia, but if you're talking about a film that launched who is considered a modern day great actor, Harrison Ford, this really launched his career. I believe he was in a film before this, American Graffiti, right? Also by
George Lucas.
Yeah, but at the time, I think he was working as a carpenter, like very unknown, and he's in this Star Wars film, and even he has said, "I did it because I wanted a job," kind of, and then it just blew up. I like to think of his Han Solo character as the audition for Blade Runner, but that's a different conversation because that is an incredible sci-fi movie that gets no love. So maybe we'll talk about that in a different podcast. But you brought up something interesting, which is Star Wars represents a cultural movement in cinema that really tapped into merchandising, I think, in a way that other films had. I'm not going to say that they created the action figure, but there was something about the merchandise they produced and how they thought about the action figures they can make would actually influence the way that films were crafted, kind of beginning from there. There's a famous kind of argument that went on over Return of the Jedi, obviously, that some of us who are fans still wonder why Lucas made this decision. But instead of having Wookiees, which would have been incredible, we got cuddly Care Bears named Ewoks, who apparently can take down some of the highest trained soldiers in all of the galaxy, which after the prequels we found out are modeled after Boba Fett himself. So that's really surprising. The point is that Star Wars really tapped into we can influence whole families. This is a film for all ages. It tapped into a fan base that is still rabid to this day that keeps attracting new folks. I don't know many film franchises that can roll over its fan base decade to decade, like Star Wars had. Now I will say we hit a little bit of a snag in the late '90s.
Oh, did we?
I'm just saying some of us, when we were children, bought Jar Jar Binks T-shirts, and then some of us, when we were adults, saved our friend in their phone as Jar Jar Binks, which is a hateful thing to do even to this day. It's a non-specific example, but
It was. I mean, being our exact age, we were born, 4 to 5 years after Return of the Jedi came out. So as we're coming of age, we can watch movies. We discovered the Star Wars movies a couple of years, 4 or 5 years before we got Episode 1. So the
Right.
build-up was insane.
and
Expectations
some
were
of
very
my
high.
some of the earliest memories I had with my mom was going to see the Star Wars special editions they re-released in theaters, and
Yeah,
so
I
we
did
saw all of them together, which kind of started a tradition of us seeing some of these films together when I was a kid. But the prequels, let's just say, were divisive. They weren't divisive by sales because I used to have these records in my head, but the amount of action figures that were sold before Phantom Menace came out, I mean, the lines, it was, you had grown men buying duplicates of 16 figures. And we can call action figures whatever we want, or you could call them dolls, but we'll call them whatever we want. I'm not trying to be demeaning of people that collect action figures at all. I'm just saying it was the first time that I had ever seen adults really desire action figures, because I thought they were kind of for kids, but it kind of transcended into this whole collectible craze, which has really continued to this day. And people collect Star Trek and all kinds of things. But I remember that high point of merchandise and excitement, and then just the woof by the time we got to the end of the last film in the prequels, Revenge of the Sith. Is that what it's called? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I was like, that's embarrassing. I can't even remember Star Wars
There are
names.
thousands of opinions, and I could talk for 2 hours about the prequels.
We're not. Let's just say that overall, they left a kind of felt like a sucker punch in the fandom as a whole. But I think that leads directly into what we want to talk about, which is why were the prequels so illy received, and then what created the hype that led to Force Awakens, and then of course The Last Jedi. I think what we're already seeing, right, is Star Wars has always had a ton of fiction written about it. I mean, book series, whole plot lines spelled out, kind of the unofficial official canon where there wasn't anyone really curtailing what the Star Wars storyline was. I mean, it's not like DC or Marvel that has to have whole departments to figure out continuity. But you had this fan base essentially creating their own stories to fit kind of their own ends, right?
Well, I mean, the novel series functioned very much like a comic book series. It was a continuing narrative for like 20,
that's a
30
good point.
years.
But it was a way for people, right, to kind of live out and live into what they wanted Star Wars to be.
Yeah.
They kind of right.
It got washed away.
Right. Right. And that brings us to The Force Awakens. So you have a fan base that's rabid, that's attracting new generations. You had the missteps of the prequels, and now we find ourselves with a fan base that is getting pumped because I still remember the day when Disney bought Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone thought there's one thing that Disney does, because you got to remember, there was a time before Disney owned every intellectual property. I know it's hard, kind of like COVID-19. We can't think before those times, but there was a time when Iron Man was, kind of this random good superhero film, and then all of a sudden Disney decides to buy Marvel, and you're kind of like, what's happening? Why is this getting so popular? And then they bought Star Wars, and you're like, holy, and you're thinking, Disney can't fail, right?
Right.
The one thing they know to do is how to make an approachable, like unoffensive movie. Like
Right.
they make films that even their worst films are like, you're like, okay, yeah, fine, that's good. I mean, most Marvel films, you're like, okay, that's like that. I've never had a negative feeling leaving a Marvel film. And Force Awakens, I will say, huge fan. I got super pumped. It was a little weird that they kind of blew up all the canon. Officially, they were kind of saying, yeah,
the canon.
Yeah. Sorry, they fired cannons in that, but I meant, like, to your point,
Yeah.
all the books, everything else they tossed out.
Sense.
But let me tell you, even with that, people were still stoked that The Force Awakens came out, right? I mean, they were almost willing to trade these years of, I'm going to get what I finally want. And then we came to 2017.
Say what you want about The Force Awakens. It gave us what we wanted, which was a simple Star Wars story. It was very similar to New Hope in structure, but that's fine because that's all we really wanted. There's a lot of hope, expectation, new characters, what's coming next, and excitement. And then,
Well, you're saying say what we want. I think The Force Awakens is a great film. I just want to go on record as saying that. But 2017 happened. And I still remember distinctly. I saw it at the Alamo Draft House on Mason Road by my house. And I saw it with CJ. And I walked out. And for the first time in my movie etiquette history, I had an emotional reaction that gave away plot points as I was leaving the building. Burns, I can bring up times in which I've left films in a silent, smoldering rage only to explode in the parking lot because that's what civilized people do. They save it for their cars. But this I couldn't. Of all the films I've ever left and all the anger I've ever experienced over how I felt about how the film went, I feel like Star Wars broke up with me in The Last Jedi. It's kind of how it felt. I felt like I showed up for our 3-year anniversary. Everything's going well, and I got the "it's not me, it's you." It's time for you to move on, Jameson. Is what it felt like. There's someone else I'm interested in, and that's the person I want to go with. And I left dejected. Ben, I know you love the film, so I'll let you step in here to talk about your love for it.
I did not love the film. I did not love it.
Almost sounds like a Dr. Seuss limerick. I did not like the film.
I did not like the film. Yeah, Rian Johnson is a very capable director, and I like some of the other movies he's directed. And he's very open with it about saying he intentionally wanted to create a movie that subverts your expectations. It's a meme by now, but that's what he said. He feels if he has created a successful movie, then half the people will hate it and half the people will love it. So I guess he created a very successful movie, but he came into it wanting to do that.
What a strange. This is really. I mean, we're gonna try to not get in the nitty gritty, but there's a couple decision points. I don't understand why Disney picked this director. I don't understand why they thought it was a good idea to pick someone who was outwardly said, I want to create something that's controversial. Like Star Wars as an entity, that's not what it's about. It's not supposed to be about pioneering, driving narratives or like, shaping the scope of cinema. And I know, because there's some of you out there, they're like, but it could be, it should be. I'm like, I guess maybe, but that's not, nowhere in its history has it done that. It's not part of its legacy. And that maybe goes to the first point we'll talk about, which is I think it's fair to say that this is an unwanted, unwelcome narrative for most fans. I mean, critics may like this, but overwhelmingly, the backlash to this was intense to the point where I think they were supposed to give him a trilogy, right? And they're like, actually,
is it officially?
I thought they officially canceled. Maybe not. Oh, maybe they brought in the Game of Thrones people and they canceled the Game of Thrones folks. I can't remember. The point is,
too many things.
I maybe misspoke there. I apologize. The point is, this really was something that did not meet expectations. And there was strong emotional reaction. You may be listening to this today. I don't know how many years in the future, hopefully being curated by the Smithsonian. And you're probably still upset about The Last Jedi. Or you still think that you're right about The Last Jedi. I've never experienced a film that created such like difference of opinion in how it was received. It felt like you either loved it as a pioneering work of genius, or you couldn't even make it out of the draft house without telling people this sucks. That was the oscillation. So maybe let's explore a little bit. What is it in us? What is it in our minds that creates this expectation? And then when it's not met, do we have such kind of a violent reaction to it? What are some of those aspects of the film, maybe from The Last Jedi, we can pull out that make it hard for us to accept that this is not the movie I wanted?
Right. Oh, I have two things really. First is we have the expectations we have of going into a Star Wars movie and not an Oscar movie or an art film. in a Star Wars movie, you expect the structure to be black and white, good guys versus bad guys. You expect there to be adventure and swashbuckling and moments where you can cheer and be excited. You're not going in it for art or to be challenged. You're going to have a good time, for the universe to be expanded, see cool new stuff, all of that. And Last Jedi intentionally tries to make it gray. So, and I'll expand on that in a minute. But my second kind of direction to go with this is that I don't think it's necessarily the worst idea to do something surprising. I think Empire in its own right was surprising because it's a very negative movie and it ends on a bad note. But I think it's the best in the trilogy. I think it was poorly executed because I think it's pretty brilliant to put Luke on a planet and being a homeless, milk drinking weirdo. That's fine, but it's not consistently done, and there's no payoff. He doesn't change. He says all this stuff, which is completely against all of the talk about Jedi that has ever been, and Rey doesn't ever learn anything or listen to him because
Right.
she takes the books that he wants to burn. He says it's time for the Jedi to die, and she goes and bees a Jedi. It's there's no redemptive narrative. There's no payoff for it. It's just like with the entire movie, you watch it what happens is the resistance goes from 400 to 12, and nothing else happens.
Right. Right. So you're talking about how they took some aggressive changing of the history of kind of the franchise and expectations, and they didn't necessarily do it in a way that seemed relevant or important. And I will say I agree. I wouldn't go so far to say it was a good idea. I don't think it was a good idea.
It had the potential to be a good idea.
Whatever you said, I don't agree with, is what I'm trying to say, politely at least. But to your point exactly, I get what you're saying. No, I'm trying to be a little playful there. My point is, there was an attempt to really change what made Star Wars.
Yeah.
And to do that in the middle of a trilogy is very bizarre to me. We had kind of seen that, I think, a little bit in Rogue One, which I believe came out between The Force Awakens and Last Jedi, which worked. I thought Rogue One is an excellent Star Wars film, in my opinion. I really appreciate what it did. Very dark tone, did not have classic Star Wars good guys. I mean, heck, one of the main good guys in the film murders someone in the opening scene.
Right.
And then everyone dies in the end. You know, like spoilers.
Well, it's a spoiler from a movie from 1977, so I think it counts.
No. Rogue One is not from 1977.
But they say that.
Oh, right.
Bring us this information. You knew that walking in.
Right. That's a good point. You thought maybe they made it out somehow. Maybe they're on a retirement farm for rebellion pilots, rebel pilots. Right, but they totally switched that, and so that creates in us a distortion of something we need to work out. Because I think if we're honest, if we have a strong emotional reaction to something, that's a lot about us. You know, we're bringing to a film that we need Star Wars to be good because it helps support us in some way.
Yeah.
And we don't like our fandom, our hobbies to feel disordered, perhaps like our lives are sometimes. You know, like we don't want to feel that disconnect. So what was maybe an extrapolation, because I think you started with 1 point, you have 2 points. So do you want to move on to the?
Well, I basically said it's just that I think having a shocking kind of turn of events is okay if there's a payoff.
Right.
But I just don't feel that the structure made it clear when we were supposed to be excited. I think the humor is so weird. It's just like, am I supposed to laugh here or not? So I think it's really about, for me, if it is worth doing, upending, subverting expectations, I think it should be done well and written better than the mess that we kind of got.
Right.
So
there needs to be some bang for your buck or kind of an investment payoff. So whereas the first one is about your general feelings overall of the being shifted, this is about I'm invested in this film in this moment. And it's interesting because it felt like, I made a little joke about how I feel like Star Wars broke up with me, but a lot of folks I listened to afterwards made it sound personal. They felt like something personally had happened to them in this film.
Right.
And I'm not even saying that I didn't have strong feelings about it, but I didn't feel like Disney was out to get me. But that whole backlash, there were folks that felt like Disney was there to tear down Star Wars. I mean, the negative press that Disney got, Disney never wants negative press. They hate negative press. And the press they got was outlandish.
Well, to be fair, it made a lot of money.
Right.
So
Right. Which I also
press goes nowhere.
Right. Which I also thought was funny. It's like, we are so upset at you that we're to continue to see this film to show you how displeased we are with, yeah.
I mean, it definitely affected money overall, and it definitely affected Rise of Skywalker, but that we're not talking about that.
Right. Well, it created this pivot point, right?
Yeah.
And I think what people are wrestling with now is, it kind of shattered the momentum of Star Wars fandom in a little bit from a movie perspective. I don't really know where people stand right now in like more Star Wars films, or they've pushed back a lot of their projects they were thinking about. I mean, Han Solo did not do very well.
It was a good movie.
I thought Han Solo was a good movie.
I thought it was an excellent movie, yeah.
Okay. We're going to stay on topic.
And let's also forget The Mandalorian is excellent as well.
Okay. Well, that's fair. But my point is, it's interesting because one of the other things that I would want to bring up is there's a little bit of comparison here, right? If you're looking at the Disney properties, I don't know how many of us are out there that love the Marvel movies. There's a lot of us because they keep making like $1 billion a piece. A bad Marvel movie makes 700 million. You're like, well, why did it do so terrible? It only made 700 million. But the other thing I've heard is this comparative nature, right? Like, our story doesn't work out the way we want. We look to this other fan base where like Marvel gets Endgame, which, the whole Infinity War Endgame payoff for a lot of folks was like a capstone of 20 plus films. And just, in my mind, I don't want to say too much because this probably will be something we can talk about further, but one of the greatest payoffs in cinema history. If you think about the number of films that went into it, it should not exist in its current state with how good as it is. Not a perfect film, but the fact that it exists and exists as well as it does is a testament to what the Russo brothers did in it. So I think there's also some comparison now where Star Wars fans are like, Disney, you look at Marvel, you make a classic Marvel movie. Every Marvel movie is the same. I happen to like them, but that's a knock on them. That's fair. They kind of have a script. The right amount of humor, a little bit of tension, finely sculpted men playing superheroes. We all like that. But Star Wars plummets. And so you probably also have that idea of a little bit of comparative shopping where we feel worse about ourselves because we look out and we see someone else that seems to have it better, some other fan base that has it better.
Because, as most fans can probably agree, you can imagine a million better ways for The Last Jedi to go.
Well, they've been written on Reddit. Go to Reddit right now and look it up.
Hey, here's how I want the movie to end. I want Kylo Ren to fight a hollow projection that he can't tell is real because he's not a real Jedi. And that's it.
You don't think that Kylo Ren is a real Jedi?
He couldn't tell that Luke wasn't actually there.
I got what you're saying. Gotcha.
And then everyone in the whole First Order watches him fighting with the hollow projection and getting embarrassed. And then he gets super angry.
Well, maybe they would argue. I'm stopping here. I was about to defend The Last Jedi. The point is, keep talking.
Let's talk about endings for a second. So it did not take us where we wanted to go because, as a particular Star Wars fan, it didn't respect really what we were looking for. And I think that if it was a different franchise or its own movie and he took some of these ideas, it might have worked really well.
Right.
So you talked about 2001 Space Odyssey. That's actually one of the examples I wanted to use here.
Well, I'm happy you asked me the question then.
It's a movie from the 60s that Kubrick put together. It did not make the millions and millions of dollars that Star Wars Last Jedi made, but it does have that kind of symbol of prestige in the sci-fi community. And it has a bizarre ending. It has a very confusing ending. No one knows what the endings are really about because it's just a bunch of images and it's mostly like poetry. Like, you just take from it what you want to take from it.
Right.
And it's very slow and honestly pretty controversial. But the structure of the movie is such that you have no idea where it's going. So you get this weird ending. You're shocked, but it makes you think. And you kind of know when you go into it that it starts off with apes and then it ends up in space. Something weird is going to go on. And
But
so
that's really well said.
so it's not that shock endings where credits just all of a sudden appear in front of you and you're like, what does that mean? You know, the artist is doing that to make you think. I didn't get that from Last Jedi. I didn't think, I just felt that I was being messed with just for the sake of not doing the cookie cutter copy of Empire that he was supposed to have done or rumored to have done, whatever. I've been fine with that.
Yeah, I saw a tweet once that said, "We didn't ask for hipster Star Wars, so you can have it back." It's kind of the thought about the Last Jedi. So you've hit a lot of good points, and I think for a lot of us listening, we hope that we are with us in the majority that universally dislike this movie. However, we recognize that if you walked into it and walked out of it with a positive experience, I would still think that you went into it because you wanted something different. Maybe you were looking for Star Wars to take a different path. And that still goes back to our point, which is we all are going to hit these narratives often in our lives. Hopefully not in our fandom. Maybe our fandom can be left alone, but definitely in our lives where it's not gonna work out the way we want.
Yeah.
There's going to be a disconnect that causes a lot of grief and anxiety. And I think often when I see people get really upset at a movie, myself included, as a pastor, I think, what else is going on in that person that's causing that? Where they were kind of putting all their eggs in the Star Wars basket to work out, and
Yeah. I don't have an answer for it, but it sums up such real and strong emotions. Is a passion that I feel about very few other things.
right, because in some
I guess
ways,
it's embarrassing.
we feel like we own the story. I think we think that we own Star Wars, and so Disney is the one that needs to apologize to us because Disney has taken something that we possess and done with it what they please. I would like to point out they did pay a couple $1 billion for it, so maybe they have the rights to it in some capacity. But you know, that's my one defense of Disney that I have now live recorded that I regret. But the whole idea is that like there seems to be when we don't get the narrative we want, it feels like it messes with our feeling of security and ownership.
Yeah.
Like it's hard for us to get back. So as I said at the beginning, when we reflect on this, I think there are stories in Scripture that speak to this as well. That life unfolds like this, and that maybe part of what drives us to argue so hard against the Last Jedi is much like our own lives. It feels like it's out of our control. And so I'm curious, Burnside, from your immense theological study, could you illuminate for us perhaps some of those stories which also speak to kind of unwelcome or unwanted endings?
Sure. So when I thought about this, I guess the main example I'd want to say is the Book of Jonah, um, not the story time kid version of the Book of Jonah, but the actual real one.
Is that one called Pinocchio?
Does no? That's a giant whale. Jonah was actually swallowed by a giant fish. I don't know if you know that.
Are,
That's another thing.
oh, are we getting arguments over whether or not whales are fish?
No, what I want to say is that Jonah ran from God's call because, as he tells God in the last chapter, he knew that if he went and preached to his hated enemies, that God would forgive them because God's a loving God. And Jonah did not want those people to be forgiven. He was upset at God for being merciful, for being loving. And so you would imagine if the ending is that Jonah does the preaching he's supposed to do and he comes to a greater understanding of love, but that is not the ending. The ending is, he's sitting there baking in the sun and God, puts a little vine to give him some shade, and then God kills the vine, so now he's back in the sun. And Jonah says, I'm angry enough about this to die. About the vine, about God making him preach to the Ninevites. He was always super angry.
That my preaching actually worked. How dare you make me one of the most
Yes.
effective preachers in Scripture?
He says one sentence and then leaves.
The greatest evangelist sermon ever given.
So yeah, and God says, "Who are you to question? Why would I not care for all these thousands of peoples and their animals if you're so concerned about a vine? Who are you to question me?" Essentially, is what he says. And the scripture ends there. We have no knowledge of if Jonah ever repented or ever got over his anger. And I kind of doubt he did, or else it might have been included. So Jonah's expected narrative of God's supposed to take care of us and love us because these are the people who, the Ninevites are the people who eventually come and destroy Israel. For a Jewish person, for us reading it historically, would have been a shocking narrative that God would tell someone to go to the evil Ninevites and preach to them, or that they would be capable of forgiveness. So it's very much about xenophobia and all this other stuff. But it's one of those shock endings that just cuts off in the middle of the story. And this was a very kind of wisdom literature approach that goes back even to the early Judaic times. So it's nothing new.
Right.
For
So what I hate
expectations.
about that example is it feels like what you're telling me is I need to be open to the fact that Star Wars maybe was created for more than me, which I don't like because that makes me feel like I need to appreciate The Last Jedi. But I think your point, it goes right to things that we hold on to the tightest are often the things that we're most in danger of not accepting kind of what happens or the possibilities that can happen. Like we want certainty.
Absolutely.
So the things that we love, especially as hobbyists, and I see this all the time and across the spectrum, is that we have a hard time accepting kind of whatever is created for creativity's sake unless it conforms to kind of what we want it to be.
Yeah.
Now,
Our imagination is hampered.
I would still argue with all of that, because I know that I'm right, that The Last Jedi is not great. However, what I also feel challenged by is that perhaps in these moments of extreme grief and stress, can we be more self-aware to acknowledge, all right, how much do I care and can I give this up a little? Because I think the one thing we didn't talk about with The Last Jedi, which we can talk about now with Jonah as well, is it's not helpful for Jonah. Like when we hold on to this anger over unwelcome narratives, it's one thing to acknowledge it, it's one thing to continue to live underneath it. And I've always taken the end of Jonah to be God telling Jonah, you're going to have to live with that and you're going to have to learn to kind of deal with it.
Right.
And so when I think about The Last Jedi, it's not going away. It is a movie that exists. It's a movie in the canon of Star Wars. And you know, this, it's hard for me to believe, but there was a time in which I felt similar about the prequels. And I've kind of moved on. So I hope for the grace and provision. Okay, good. Well, that's a good spectrum. I'm a healthy human being, and here's a rabid Star Wars fan. But I love that example, Burnside, because I think it's a reminder for all of us. It's okay to have expectations. It's okay to hold on tight. We can come in kind of with this concrete view of how it should be, but if we're not more open, I think we're just setting ourselves up for an increased level or increased risk of just being disappointed with what happens in life.
Yeah.
I don't mean this as like a self-help message. Like, you know, you have the power of you to meet the day, because there are some traumatic events that happen, and I don't want to downplay what anyone goes for. But at the end of the day, as my dad told me after he heard me ranting about The Last Jedi, it's just a movie, and that doesn't take away from its power, but also it should focus kind of our ability to try to appreciate it, because it is still part of the franchise that we love. And I'm not the biggest Star Wars fan. I mean, I've never missed a Star Wars film, but I still try to do that. Doesn't mean I'd ever own it on DVD. But the point is, do people even buy DVDs anymore?
Yeah, I was about to say, if you're buying DVDs, I don't know where.
Doesn't mean I would ever own it on special release VHS. I made that mistake once, Lucas. I'm not doing it again.
Well, you pay for Disney Plus and it's on there, so.
Ooh. So I guess I am indirectly supporting it. Well, that's a whole conundrum to work through. So that kind of concludes our deep dive through talking about The Last Jedi, working on kind of some of the parameters that affect our fandom, reflecting a little bit on what Scripture had to say about other unwanted
It's
matters.
really just made me sad, actually.
Made you really sad?
Yeah.
Sometimes, sadly, life is a little sad.
Yeah.
There's a reason that Eeyore stays in Winnie the Pooh.
Eeyore's my favorite character in Winnie the Pooh.
I could totally see that. You're totally an Eeyore. Anyways, wow, that sounded derogatory. I love all the Eeyores out there, just not the Eeyore with me in the room, is what I'm saying. All right. So we appreciate your walk along that. You know, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. So reach out to us to chat with us about how you take The Last Jedi, whether you're totally in our camp of being negative, whether you think that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Maybe you slice your bread with a lightsaber, so we'd love to hear that. But we always like to close with a little bit of a look ahead section to put something on your radar that you may not be thinking about. So, Burnside, what is something coming up that you're kind of thinking about? Huh, this is something neat to kind of talk about or mention.
I don't think this fits the parameters of what you just said, but
Well, you know what? Much like The Last Jedi, why don't you just give me whatever you're going to give me, and I will try to receive it
I was
with
thinking
open.
more in the frame of what am I excited about? So I'm going to answer that question instead. I just watched the Hamilton thing on Disney Plus.
You finally
I
watched
finally watched it.
it, and
It's hard to find 3 hours. Anyway, I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
isn't it ridiculously good?
It is ridiculously good, and I recently started reading the Hamilton biography. And
Oh, okay.
it is fascinating. So it's been out for forever, really, but I'm really enjoying it and have been kind of steeping myself in American history. Did you know to enter college during that time, you had to be fluent in Latin and translate the Bible from Greek to either Latin or English just to be accepted?
So you're saying that admission standards were a little lower back then than they are today?
You could also, like James Madison and some other people, entered like 15. Some people entered Princeton as early as 12 years old.
Wow. Well, I couldn't even get to Princeton
It
now.
was a different time.
Wow, that is a different time. That's cool. So yeah, Hamilton, Disney Plus bought the rights, I think, to distribute their version of the musical. So they've released that. I still think it would have been interesting to see what would happen if it hit theaters. I think it would have made them. Well, it probably is making them money now, but it would have been a huge kind of cinematic experience. And staying on that topic, I'm actually very interested in the announcement over Mulan that it will be coming as a rental to the Disney Plus platform.
Oh, the new one?
Yeah, so they're going to release it to Disney Plus to essentially kind of do a video on demand through their own system. Which the reason I'm looking forward to that, one, I want to see Mulan, looks cool, and two, I'm wondering if that's going to signal a massive change in the cinema industry. I'm wondering if studios have been waiting for months now to figure out what to do.
Well, they were doing on-demand releases.
Yeah, but not with a major. Mulan will be the first major blockbuster. I mean, if you think about the kind of film it was poised to make 500 million, 600 million, 700 million at the box office.
You don't think Trolls World Tour made $500 million?
I'm not putting Mulan in that category. No. But my thinking is, what are they going to do with their Marvel movies? That's kind of the next big step. Because this, to me, if Disney is doing this, this signals to me they are concerned about the long-term viability of releasing some of their products through theaters. And they're going to use Mulan, which is a big name, but not the Black Widow movie. And they're going to see how Mulan does. And if it generates a lot of money, I'm wondering if you're going to see Black Widow and other films next.
I'm down for that. I think I'd still want to go to the theater when I'm able, if I was able now. But I've rented a couple movies, and I think paying I'm more than happy to pay $20 and make my own popcorn.
Right.
So.
I guess the one bad part would be what happens to all those cinemas if they lose kind of contact with distributors like that. How are they going to survive from movie to movie without knowing that they're going to get Mulan or Black Widow? I mean, they could. I don't care about like the AMC's and the Cinemarks of the world. I shouldn't say that to anyone out there. I do care about their employees, but I'm more worried about like the more independent places like the Alamo Drafthouse.
Yeah, Drafthouse is going to be fine.
You think so?
Yeah, because you go there for an experience. You don't go there because you have to go like to a you have to just see a movie. You have to go to a seminar. But when you go to the Drafthouse, you're going because you want the experience.
So you're saying my grief is a little unfounded?
Well, I'm just being hopeful. Unlike The Last Jedi, which is not hopeful. It's poorly written.
Awesome. Well, on that note, as we wrap up this podcast, we really appreciate your time with us. We hope you've enjoyed our conversation on The Last Jedi, on unwelcome narratives, the ways in which we bring a lot to the stories we experience, and we have to be really honest about how we contribute to our own emotional reaction to that, and ways that perhaps we need to work on being a little bit more receptive for our own sanity. But we hope to see you on our next podcast. And until then, I'm Jameson, your resident expert.
We messed up a rhythm. And I'm Ben Burnside.
You're supposed to say our resident theologian.
Oh, our resident theologian.
This is going smashingly.